Coming up on Primetime Lawmakers, the Senate passes the $18.5 billion 2012 amended budget, moving $42 million from Hope Scholarship funding to the Zell Miller Scholarship. It's not final passage, though. The changes must first be worked out with the House. A bill requiring schools to offer and pay for online courses to students draws heated debate in the Senate. The state charter schools bill is moving right along as it passes the Senate Education Committee. Only yesterday, the House passed the measure by a narrow margin. The long-awaited Juvenile Justice Code rewrite passes the House Judiciary Committee. It's the first rewrite to the code in decades, but reforms could cost the state millions. And to examine that charter schools legislation as it moves to the Senate, tonight I'll be joined on set by Senate Majority Leader Chip Rogers and Senate Democratic Whip Vincent. If you've got school-age children, you're going to want to stay tuned for this. For Thursday, February 23rd, 2012, the 24th legislative day of the Georgia General Assembly, Primetime Lawmakers is coming up. Good evening and welcome to Primetime Lawmakers, GPB's nightly coverage of the Georgia General Assembly. I'm Scott Slade. Let's go straight live to the Capitol where Keosha Howard reports the Senate has passed the FY 2012 amended budget.
That's right, Scott. The little budget passes out of the Senate today. Democrats say that a major area of concern for them is changes made to Hope and the Zell Miller Scholarship.
This amended budget includes an increase in funds for the Zell Miller Scholarship program of $42.8 million approximately. And by my math, that more than doubles and almost triples the amount that the governor had originally appropriated. Is that accurate?
Well, I will tell you where the figure came from. The senator from the 18th chairs that subcommittee, and my understanding is these are truing up amounts that were given to us by the Student Finance Commission that basically mirror the actual issuance of these funds.
Senate Democrats believe the Zell Miller Scholarship will effectively eat up all of Hope Scholarship's funding.
That program for the privileged few will eat far more of the regular Hope Scholarship for the middle class than we believed. This adds, the Senate version adds $42 million, which more than doubles the cost of that particular scholarship program. So there were miscalculations apparently in the original version of in the governor's budget, and to see the Senate fix it by that large of a margin was surprising to us.
Earlier this week, the governor called for a $47 million reduction in the supplemental budget. The change was made by delaying payment to the Care Management Association. That change sends it back to the House. The Senate today also passed a bill that would require students to complete at least one online course to graduate from high school. Senator Vincent opposes the measure. He says that it limits local control by putting a mandate on local school systems.
I mean, this is essentially, is it not, a bill that mandates the participation of students in the online courses? Is that not true?
It says beginning with students entering the 9th grade during the 14-15 school year, that by the time they graduate, they need to have at least one online class, yes. But of course, the State Board of Education could waive that for specific instances where that was not available.
The core question that we should confront this morning is whether or not we should be mandating to local systems, whether we should be mandating to teachers, whether we should be mandating to schools, the local schools, that they should offer online courses. A mandate is a mandate is a mandate. You can put a tutu on a pig, but it's still a pig. You can put a tutu on a mandate, but it's still a mandate. And that's the issue here.
Senator Vincent did attempt to amend the bill to give local schools the option to implement an online course mandate. The amendment failed, and the bill does go to the House as is. The constitutional amendment that would allow the state to charter schools is picking up some speed, passing out of 2 subcommittees today in a matter of hours. Both the Senate Education and Youth Committee and the full Senate Education Committee heard testimony on the controversial resolution. Tony Roberts, CEO of Georgia Charter Schools Association, says his organization supports the constitutional amendment and charter schools are good for Georgia.
The news that charter schools are not valuable to us is not right. They do perform a very good service, and there are a lot of parents and kids that depend on having this as an option. And even where they're great schools, there are students that need this opportunity. And I think they're proving themselves here in the state of Georgia. So I would ask your support of this resolution.
Organizations opposed to the resolution also testified.
The state has an important role to play in education, but one of its roles is not to act as a local board. It doesn't have the structure or the capacity to do that. So we think it should not do that. The state can charter schools now. It has, as has already been discussed. Since the Supreme Court decision came down, they've approved 12 schools. There are others in the pipeline.
With the bill as currently written, without any financial language in it, is that we have a big question mark about how this bill is going to be funded. We know from the current version, or at least the version that's been floating around the Capitol of House Bill 797, the enabling legislation, we have some idea about how the sponsors would calculate the funding that would, the extra funding that would go to state charter schools. But unfortunately, what I don't think we have gotten to the bottom of is, where is this funding coming from?
Speaker Pro Tem Jan Jones says the enabling legislation does spell out how state charter schools will be funded.
We worked extensively both with Republicans and Democrats to address their concerns primarily about the funding, so that it is perfectly clear in the Constitution that state charter schools would be funded with general funds out of our budget, and there would be no connection to local school boards' monies. The funding for state charter schools would be calibrated to the lowest funded students in Georgia, and it would make clear that there would be an incentive for charter petitioners to try to get approved locally.
The resolution narrowly passes out of the Senate Education Committee by a vote of 7-5 and now goes to Senate rules before being placed on the full Senate calendar. Scott?
Moving along, Keosha, Senator Rogers and Senator Fort will be along to talk about it live in just a few minutes. Thanks. Georgia could join 45 other states to allow the private purchase of solar energy. The Senate Committee for Regulated Industries and Utilities took up a bill that would allow private consumers to buy solar power from a third party without government regulations. WSB Radio's consumer expert Clark Howard testified it's a free market issue and Georgia should join the modern era of how power is generated. Georgia Power representatives testified it would create a whole new class of electricity suppliers with no oversight. The committee tabled the bill and could take it up next week. Well, the wait for a reformed juvenile justice system in Georgia may be finally over after 30 years and a 2-hour committee meeting today. Supporters of the bill crowded in the House Judiciary Committee to share stories of why the current law must be rewritten. However, the concern today wasn't whether or not the code should change, but how it would be funded. The committee members unanimously agreed to the bill in the hope of setting out a new policy for the juvenile code that would pay more attention to specific issues such as juvenile detentions harming families and kids' developmental skills. The only block standing in the way is quite a big one: funding. And that question may have to be answered next year. The bill passed by a committee substitute is amended and moves to House rules. We now go back to the Capitol, where primetime lawmaker Sandra Parrish reports a bill on vicious dogs has cleared subcommittee.
Scott, you may recall the little girl in DeKalb County who was mauled back in 2010 by 2 dogs belonging to her neighbor. As a result, she lost her arm. The owner in that case was sentenced last month to 16 months in jail and 3 years probation. But under the bill by Representative Penny Houston, that charge would be a felony, punishable up to 3 years in prison and a $20,000 fine.
If you're going to own something that's going to kill, maul, or disfigure somebody for the rest of their life, somebody's got to be held responsible.
Representative Penny Houston sponsored the bill not only because of 10-year-old Aaron Ingram, but other attacks around the state as well.
I live in a rural area, but it's not just a rural area. It's whether we had a lady die in Valdosta in December, or whether we have a child in DeKalb County that had his arm had to be removed, or whether we had a child in Savannah that was completely disfigured because a vicious dog, and a dog that had been classified as a vicious dog attacked him. And the dog owners need to be responsible for these acts.
Representative Charlize Byrd was among only 2 members in the House Judiciary Non-Civil Committee to vote against it.
I'm concerned about who all defines a vicious dog. Does it happen once? Does it happen twice? Does the animal control state what a vicious dog is? Georgia is in the process of trying to change the criminal justice system and going through the laws, and everything in Georgia is a felony. So I have another concern about that, so that we're putting more people in prison as a felon.
Houston says vicious dogs are already defined in law as those that have caused severe injury without provocation before, and the owner has knowledge of that.
You'll read that you have to be classified as a vicious dog before this penalty would go into effect.
Now that bill regarding the vicious dogs moves to the House Rules Committee, which will decide whether to bring it before the full House for a vote. In the House today, a bill that would require schools to have a person trained in diabetic care easily passed. It was a personal connection that prompted Representative Matt Ramsey to sponsor the measure.
8 or 9 months ago, my child, my 7-year-old, was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And I had no idea what it takes to manage the disease on a daily basis until I saw it firsthand. Now, what this bill seeks to do is to make sure that the kids right now that are sitting in classrooms all over the state of Georgia that are managing this disease are provided an environment where there are people that know what to do in the event of an emergency and help them manage the disease on a day-to-day basis. First, the bill requires the state to develop a uniform training protocol. The American Diabetes Association does this. There's laws like this on the books in 32 other states. We'll provide this to the state free of charge. There's no cost to developing the training. Two, it makes sure that every single school that has a kid with diabetes in it has at least one person in the building at all time that's trained in what to do in managing, particularly an emergency situation, a child with diabetes.
The bill passed the House 136 to 26 and now moves to the Senate. A bill to ban assisted suicides in Georgia passes out of a House subcommittee this afternoon. It would make it a felony punishable up to 10 years in prison, and physicians who violate the law could lose their medical license.
There's no law in Georgia that makes it illegal to assist someone else in killing themselves.
The bill by Representative Ed Setzler is in response to a Georgia Supreme Court decision this month that threw out a state law from 1994 saying it violated free speech rights and prohibiting advertisements by groups like the Final Exit Network. The ruling means 4 members of the Georgia-based group won't have to stand trial in connection with the Forsyth County man's death.
The prospect that someone ought to be assisted in putting a bag over their head where helium's pumped in to kill them of helium asphyxiation, the fact that that's a legal thing to do, I think is very troubling to most Georgians and I think needs to be addressed.
The bill really memorializes what I think everyone always thought the law was in Georgia, that assisted suicide is illegal. We support anything related to the preservation of life. And I think this is a deterrent to people who would get involved with other people and terminate their lives early.
And Representative Setzler expects that bill to go before the full Judiciary Non-Civil Committee as soon as Monday. Scott?
Much, Sandra. One of the biggest issues to come up in this session of the Georgia General Assembly. The House yesterday narrowly achieved the 2/3 constitutional majority to approve a measure that'll let voters decide if the state should have the power to charter schools and to fund them. Today, it was passed by the Senate Education Committee, so it's moving on. Joining me now to talk about the constitutional amendment and the funding plans for state charter schools are Senate Democratic Whip Vincent Fort and Senate Majority Leader Chip Rogers, 2 strong voices on the issue. Both men will doubtless be familiar to our viewers. Thank you so much for taking time to come down and talk to us about this important issue.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to do a little quasi-campaign debate format here. I'm going to give each of you a minute for opening arguments and then a little rebuttal. And since you're on the pro side, Senator Rogers, we'll start with you here. A minute to talk about why you're in favor of this.
Well, Scott, if you're happy with what the education system in Georgia, then you should vote against this. You should just say we're not going to have any more options. We're going to continue to do what we do and think and hope and pray that a miracle will come and all of a sudden Georgia's going to be a leader in education. But if you don't believe that, like I believe 95% of Georgians don't believe that, then you need to begin to look at other options. This is an option that is available for parents. It's very simple. If charter schools aren't working, parents will close them down themselves because they won't send their children there. But the idea that we'll stick with the model that has taken us to 47th or 48th nationwide in education and subject our children to that year after year, generation after generation, hoping that it somehow gets better, is not a model that I want to support and not a model that the taxpayers deserve. What we need is more options for parents, more options for children, and this is something that has worked across the nation. It's working here in Georgia, and we need to allow it to go before the voters to see if they decide they want to do it.
Okay, thanks very much for that minute. And Senator Fort, you're against the idea of chartering state schools. A minute from you, sir. Why?
Well, you know, this is not a question of whether or not you support charter schools. Charter schools are a good thing in some instances, but it's a question of who should be making that decision. Should it be an unelected, unaccountable group of folk at the state capitol, or should it be the voters of the cities and towns that elect school board members? I think that most people don't want bureaucrats or don't want an unelected commission at the state capitol determining whether they're going to have a new school in their district. I think that most people want the school board members that they elect on a regular basis, who they can hold accountable, to be the people to determine whether there's going to be a new school in that district. Charter schools are a good thing in many instances, but that's not the issue. It's a matter of whether there's going to be local control.
All right, thanks for that minute. Some rebuttal from Senator Rogers on that.
Well, Vincent's exactly right. It should be who makes the decision, which is what this resolution is about. This is a constitutional amendment. All we're asking is that it go to the ballot and let the people make the decision. I don't need a government bureaucrat telling me what's best for my child. I don't need people, even in elected office, telling me what's best for my child. What I want to have the opportunity to do, and I believe most Georgians want the opportunity to do, is go to the ballot box and say, we believe this is the type of education system we want. I'm not sure why people are fearful of allowing the voters to determine this.
All right, Senator Ford, rebuttal.
Well, you know, just last week, the Department of Education, which tends to be very pro-charter school, issued a report saying that the returns from charter schools, that is the achievement of charter schools, is on par or below that of our regular charter schools. We're devoting a lot of time and energy on this issue of a constitutional amendment, process technicalities. We ought to be looking at what makes student achievement better in our charter schools and our regular public schools as well.
All right, thanks. A couple of questions, both of you now. And Senator Rogers, start with you here. How does the state education system as a whole benefit from state chartered schools?
Well, first of all, I don't ever look at the education question from the position of the system or the individual school. It's all, to me, directed on the child, the student. Because even the best schools don't work for every student that is assigned to go to that school, and we as politicians create these nebulous lines and we say everybody in this box must go to that school. So you could have the best school, but it doesn't necessarily mean that every child that lives there, that's the best resource for them. So what we really need to look at, and the lens we need to look at it through, is that of the student. I always ask this very simple question. Isn't giving children more educational options better than giving them fewer options? So we should always strive to give more options so that we can individualize education.
And Senator Fort, the idea of letting the people of the state decide, is there a fundamental problem with that on this issue?
Well, I think the people decide every 4 years in most instances when they go to vote for their school board members. This is about whether or not we're going to have a school systems that are controlled by the people who live in those school systems, as opposed to the governor or a group of 38 senators voting for a constitutional amendment. I think most people are comfortable with the school board members that they know and that they have interactions with and are able to call on.
As far as the Democratic bloc of senators is concerned, it's going to take at least a couple of you to make this happen with a 2/3 majority. Are you guys united on this issue?
I think we're pretty much united, but it's not only going to take us to be united, it's going to also call for independent thinking Republicans of goodwill on the other side to really think seriously about this issue. And you know, and so I think it's not only a Democrat, it's a bipartisan issue in a sense of trying to maintain local control in the school system.
Senator Rogers, when do you call for a vote on this?
Hopefully soon, because I believe there are Democrats that want to do this, because I know I would have a real tough time going home and looking a constituent in the face and saying, you know what, I don't trust you enough to make this decision. I trust the voters of Georgia. They should make this decision. And to the point of every 4 years you get to elect your school board, that's a third of a child's entire time in K through 12 education. I don't want to wait 4 years if my child is stuck in a failing school. I don't want to wait 4 weeks. If it's not working, give the children an additional option.
Is there any room for compromise between the two of you on this, or is there a real indelible line, at least on the state charter issue?
I think on this issue of state authorization, of whether the state is going to determine whether a school system has a school or whether the people of that district are going to determine it, I don't know if this session there's an area for compromise. I think there's some compromises that could be achieved in the offing in the future. Local independent authorizers may be the way to go, but I think Either you believe in local control or you don't.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for coming, and thanks for your service. We'll get you back on this.
All right.
Appreciate seeing you. We got to take a short break, but don't go anywhere. Much more to come as we bring in two of the best political journalists in the state. When we come back, Tom Crawford of the Georgia Report, Jim Galloway, the AJC's political insider. Don't go away. We have a lot to put into perspective for you in just a moment. Welcome back to Primetime Lawmakers Time. For our Reporter Roundtable, part of the show, we tap our stable to the best political journalist in the state. I'm joined by two deans of the Capitol Press Corps, Tom Crawford, editor of the Georgia Report, and Jim Galloway, the AJC's political insider. It's great to have some of the old gang back here. And since you're the deans of the Press Corps, you know how these things work. But what do you think about the charter schools amendment discussion we just had, Jim?
Well, I would make 2 points. Number one, you are in different ground now. You're in the Senate, and the Senate has had some organizational problems with some factional fighting on the Republican side. So this is going to be a vote that requires a lot of discipline, and the Senate hasn't really been very good at administering Republican discipline within the camp. So there's that. The other thing I would point out is if this does pass, this goes on to the November ballot, and it brings a really interesting fight to a November contest that will also include the presidential contest. And you're bringing in, you will bring in tons of PTA people, tons of school teachers, and those aren't necessarily Republican voters. So I think it's got an interesting impact there.
Tom.
Well, and just as the Republicans in the Senate, as Jim said, had a bit of a discipline problem, the Democrats in the Senate, it's easier for them to be more united than they were in the House because they're a smaller group, maybe less likely that they would split up like the Democrats did in the House. And remember, in the House, it only passed by a couple or 3 votes, even with some Democrats peeling off. So that makes it a little bit different calculus there, I think, for getting it passed.
Other issues, the FY 2012 amended budget passed the Senate today. Any surprises on the amount of money, maybe difference from what the House passed? Tom?
No, I don't think so. Jack Hill, the Senate Appropriations Chairman, said there were only cosmetic changes between the 2 versions of it. They may even be able to get it worked out without going to a formal conference committee meeting, get it cleared out of the way, and go on to the fiscal year 13 budget.
It sounds like, Jim, there's not that many fights over money.
No, there hasn't been. And again, we go back to this, we go back to the disarray in the Senate. They are very disinclined to form conference committees. And if they can fix this, if they can do what Tom has described and fix this with just a single patch, they'll do that in a heartbeat.
You know, you're never at a lack of surprise at what can happen. The tone of the debate today on online courses in the Senate, was that surprising to anyone, or is that back to the local control issue? Really?
That's partly the local control issue, and I thought it was a fairly routine issue, and all of a sudden it became a very heated debate as between Vincent Ford and Chip Rogers, who we just had on here as guests. So you never know what's going to get them flaring up here.
Oh, I think it was a subset of the charter school debate. What was interesting was over in makeup, these guys who went out so hard this morning, they were fine with each other. They're actually quite collegial.
I think they quite honestly call each other colleagues for a reason, and they are. They're doing the state's business, and the state's business will also include juvenile justice reform. Finally, it looks like we have some language. A bill may be moving along, 300 pages, huge rewrite, but it's going to cost some money to implement it, isn't it?
It is, and this is something that the juvenile justice advocates have been trying to get through for quite a few years here, and they have made more progress this session than they ever had before, and I think they do have a real chance of passing it now. And yes, it will be more expensive, but they will tell you that they really do need to overhaul the treatment of children in this state.
Jim, are we going to see any fights over drug testing for state benefits like unemployment benefits or anything of that?
Well, you know, that came up last week. I hit the governor up on it. We've already got some bills out there that would mandate drug testing for welfare benefits, and that's a fairly orthodox portion of the Republican playbook. But Deal said he would consider a bill that would require drug testing for unemployment benefits, which takes it into a new territory, especially when you've got 9% unemployment, and that could be overstepping. I don't know yet.
Okay. Any action on that in
Not yet.
Your
We haven't seen a bill yet on that one.
Meanwhile, they did find some time to talk about the legality of holding moonshine tastings, Tom.
Indeed, they did. And what better way to wrap up a legislative week than to note that the House did pass a bill to allow distilleries to, I think, give half-ounce samples at free tastings. And it was written to benefit a distillery in Milledgeville that actually makes legal moonshine. So if there's a better Georgia tradition, I'm not aware of it.
It is amazing to me. We had this huge fight last year over Sunday sales of alcohol, and this thing just went through smoothly, as smoothly as bourbon say.
As smoothly as a good sipping whiskey.
And the good thing about a moonshine tasting, unlike a wine tasting, you only need one glass.
That's right.
Probably.
There you go.
Hey, it's great to have the two of you with us. We'll check
Great
back,
to be here.
okay? Thanks for coming tonight. Coming up tomorrow on Lawmakers, a bill prohibiting abortions after 20 weeks gets a hearing in the House Judiciary Non-Civil Committee. And it's the end of another legislative week. We'll take a look back and discuss the week's happenings with two great political minds, Buddy Darden and Chuck Clay, plus all the latest news from under the Gold Dome. That's tomorrow on Primetime Lawmakers right here at 7. If you missed any part of this broadcast, catch Primetime Lawmakers when it repeats at 5:30 here tomorrow morning. Coming up next on GPB, it's Georgia Outdoors. Host Sharon Collins explores Georgia's newest national heritage areas, Panola and Arabia Mountains, a legacy of land. That's on Georgia Outdoors, coming up next only on GPB. And that's our broadcast for this 24th legislative day of the 2012 session. I'm Scott Slade. Join us tomorrow night at 7 for Primetime Lawmakers. Have a great night.
This is a GPB original production.